What about the chronic disease epidemic? That's even a bigger problem, because we're now spending, when my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60%. We spent, when my uncle was president, about 4% of GDP on healthcare costs. Today, it's around 20% and climbing. The biggest cost is chronic disease. $4.3 trillion a year that we're spending on chronic disease. And who's making money from that? The pharmaceutical companies. And who owns all those pharmaceutical companies? Yeah, BlackRock. Oh, and those pharmaceutical companies are causing it with, some of the bad medicines they give us, and then they're reaping the harvest of all that chronic disease. But also the processed food companies. The processed food companies, which bought up the tobacco companies, Kraft went to work for Philip, became a subsidiary of Philip Morris, et cetera. And they brought 10,000 scientists, many of them from the tobacco industry, to make processed foods addictive and to make them so that they don't fill you. And we now have 1,000 ingredients in our processed foods in this country that are illegal in Europe. Is it any wonder that we have a chronic disease epidemic in this country? And who owns all of those processed food companies? BlackRock. And who is one of the biggest owners of both the Republican and Democratic Party? Right? So they're not allowed to solve that problem. They're not, because there are people making money on that problem who are giving them money. And that's one of the reasons they needed to get me out of the Democratic Party. That's one of the reasons they needed to get Bernie Sanders out of the Democratic Party. Oh, and this is, we're now spending more on diabetes than we do on our entire military budget. When I was a kid, when my uncle was president, a typical pediatrician saw one diabetes case in his entire lifetime. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door has diabetes. And nobody's talking about this. President Trump and President Biden aren't talking about it. They're not going to solve it. They have no way to. They presided over this dramatic increase in it. You will never hear them even discuss it. And yet it's the most important issue in our country, because if we don't solve this problem, our budget is going to be out of control and our kids are all going to be sick.